Consequently,
This boy is a builder of dreams, of castles. But he is learning. He's experiencing the feeling of building. He has built forts of blocks. He has built whole cities of cards. And on the beach, he builds a castle. He has brought to his work on the beach all that he's learned from what he has built before. He knows there are sides to what he builds, and there is beauty to him in what he sees. But the builder of castles in the sand builds only a temporary structure. This boy is a builder of dreams, of castles today, maybe of buildings tomorrow.
Tulane Close-Up, a view of education in action. Presented by Tulane University in cooperation with WDSU-TV New Orleans.
You know, sometime in his life, every man is an architect. When he's a child, or with training when he's a man. Now, the problems that the architect sets out to solve is how best to enclose space for human occupancy. The architect must be an expert in the planning of buildings. He must know how to arrange the parts of these buildings in the most economical and convenient manner. For the art of planning is the very basis of architecture. It is with design that the architect is primarily and ultimately concerned, and he must think in three dimensions: plan, section, and elevation, in such a way that the resulting structure is expressive and functional. And so we can say that architecture is a coming together of science and art, the work of building so as to apply both beauty and utility, the creative beauty that is the contribution of the architect himself, and he must be instructed how to make the technical sciences the servants of his art. Now, these are the tools of his profession: his plans, his models, his drawing pencil, but most important, his creative mind. There are three questions that we can ask about architecture. What is architecture? What can it be? And what will it be? And we will ask them of Dean John Dinwiddie, Dean of the School of Architecture at Tulane University. Dean Dinwiddie, let's start with the first question. What is architecture? Now, we've said that it's a coming together of science and art. Would you say that's a true definition?
Not entirely. It is partially true. It is a science in that a building naturally must be built to stand up and resist all kinds of wind pressures, hurricanes here, and in my part of the country where I come from, San Francisco, earthquakes. It is an art in that it is a creative process. The architect creates something out of nothing and ends up with a building which...
Well, now, would you say the architect has to be a scientist as well as an artist?
Oh, yes. Yes, he has to be both. It's a combination of both.
Well, now, today, in this age of competition between nations, who would you say is producing truly great architecture?
Well, it would be difficult to say what or who is producing any great architecture today. We are going through a confusing time, and we're doing many fine buildings, and it will only take the test of time to know whether they're great or not.
Well, what about American architecture now? Are we holding our own with some of the leading architects of the rest of the world?
Yes, I believe that the best architecture in the world, the best training and the best schools are here in America. This is in contrast to what it was, say, before 1925, when there were no adequate schools and American architects and artists went to Paris, to Rome to study. And we developed a feeling that anything European was automatically better than what we have.
Well, now, isn't that feeling prevalent today? It doesn't seem to me that most people recognize our American schools as famous as some of the European schools.
That is true. The old feeling still holds, even though the process is reversed. The Europeans are now coming to study in American schools, just as we used to go to them.
Well, would you say then that we are developing or have developed a school of American architecture?
We are developing a school of American architecture. We have not arrived at it. It will be a long time to develop something that we all agree upon. At present, there is quite a lot of confusion.
Dean Dinwiddie, what are some of the forces that are contributing, let us say, to the development of this truly American school of architecture? Are they coming together from different parts of the country?
Yes, the problem of regionalism. The West Coast architecture is quite different from the East Coast architecture. We have been influenced terrifically by the foreigners, particularly from Germany and Austria, who have come to this country to work. And it is a question as to who is going to arrive at the right answer. I think it will be a compromise between all of them.
Well, now, you mentioned something about regionalism. Are there any great schisms, let us say, in American architecture today? For example, we have a distinctive architecture down here in the South, don't we, that is distinctive from the East and from the West?
Yes, we do. I would say that the South is kind of caught between the East and the West. And we find the American architecture, as exemplified by Frank Lloyd Wright, quite a powerful influence. At the same time, men like Van der Rohe and Gropius, they have a terrific influence also.
Well, now, who would you say, then, are some of the more famous of the American architects today?
I would hesitate to name who I think is famous today, largely because I might be embarrassed by omissions. But I would cite one example, Edward D. Stone of New York, and everybody, I think, has seen pictures of his American pavilion at the Brussels World Fair. It is one of the fine buildings. I don't know whether it's great or not. We're not so familiar with his American embassy at New Delhi, India, which already seems to be recognized even by Frank Lloyd Wright as one of the great works of the world.
Well, now, you mentioned two of his foreign creations, but what has he done in America?
He's done a great many American buildings. Presently, he's doing many college campuses, one, I believe, in Arkansas. He's remodeling and doing over the master plan for the Stanford campus in Palo Alto, California.
Well, now, in going back into the past and the history of architecture, I think you have some very interesting pictures here. Could we take a look at some of these pictures?
Yes, I do. I think it might be informative to see what has been great in the past.
All right. Suppose we look at some of these pictures right now.
This is a picture of the pyramids, perhaps the best known and most symbolic, if not the oldest, buildings in the world. Here, architecture reflects an intensely religious people who believe that immortality can be attained only through permanent residence on Earth. The embalming of bodies in their mummies is one expression. The pyramids were to them the ultimate in permanent construction. Certainly no buildings before or since have withstood the ravages of time as well. In later centuries was discovered the principle of the stone arch, the vault, and the dome. This was a revolutionary thing to them, just as our industrial revolution is to us. The Taj Mahal is one of the great wonders of the world and is the ultimate in one kind of masonry construction of arches and domes. It was carried to a point of such perfection that they could think of no more to do with it in the way of improvement, so it is covered with mosaic patterns of all kinds. Then in later centuries, the arch and the vault in masonry construction took another turn, largely in French Gothic architecture, of which the Cathedral of Chartres is one of the finest examples. It is supposed to contain the most beautiful stained glass in the world, and I don't doubt that, although I do know that we have many examples in America, done by Americans recently, which are just as beautiful. is one of the earliest of the steel frame buildings. This is the Halliday building in San Francisco, and whereas it is not the first steel frame building by a long shot, it is the first all-glass front. It was designed in 1910 by Willis Polk, about the time of the Woolworth building in New York. Mr. Polk had a client who saw further than he, and it started to be a Gothic adaptation such as the Woolworth building is. But the client insisted on more and more glass and windows than any Gothic building had ever had. Finally, in exasperation, Mr. Polk said, well, I will give you all glass if you want. And I think to his consternation, the client said, fine, go ahead and do it. And he did, and this is the result.
Well, now you said earlier, Dean Dinwiddie, that architecture is a solution to human environment. Is that true today? It was in the past, wasn't it?
Yes. I think every building today should be considered in relation to its surroundings, in relation to its community, and to its city. The day of the significance of the individual building is largely lost. The overwhelming impact of the automobile and transportation has made things so complicated that any single building is in danger of being lost in the shuffle.
Well, now, in planning, let us say, a building with a certain environment, is the environment of the future also taken into consideration when the architect plans this building?
It should be. The architect and the city planner are coming closer and closer together at all the time. Many states have legislation requiring that city planners and architects work together. This is true of New Orleans, and we will hear later from Mr. Louis Bissot as to how these two relate.
Well, I think we have a few very excellent examples of New Orleans architecture, so suppose we take a look at them right now.
This is a group of houses recently done near the Tulane campus, and this is quite a large site of where one house stood before, and now there are 4 houses. It's a good example of community planning, of the trying to relate a house to its environment and to place each house to its best advantage, to give each one the maximum privacy and the best use of the land that he can find. Within this group of 4 houses, we find 3 different concepts of modern architecture. They are all good. I couldn't say which is better than another, but they do seem to be in harmony with their surroundings. They certainly do not clash. I do not think any neighbors object to them. Here we have our Civic Center group, and this is one example of local large-scale planning where the planning was done in cooperation with the City Planning Commission, and New Orleans, as many other cities, outgrew their city centers and fortunately had the opportunity to have the land and the place to develop a new civic center which would adequately serve for tens of years to come. This is the Pan American building in New Orleans, and I mentioned a moment ago the problem of sun control, and this is one of the answers to it, the placing of gigantic vertical Venetian blinds upon the outside of it. Here is a building which is large enough and has enough land to control its own surroundings. It is in little danger of being spoiled by the encroachment of factories or slums or any other conditions. This is also partly the responsibility of the City Planning Commission. of the new dormitories on the university campus of Tulane. They're about 5 years old. They were designed by the faculty of the School of Architecture in cooperation with local architects. It reflects the changing times and the changing needs of universities, and particularly Tulane, and the increase of the resident population of Tulane.
This talk of individual buildings and then groups of buildings brings us to the question of community planning. The School of Architecture is concerned with the life of the city. Now let me introduce you to some men who are architects and whose jobs are concerned with community planning. This is Mr. John Lawrence, an architect on the faculty of the Tulane School of Architecture, Mr. Louis Bissot, city planner of New Orleans, and Mr. Charles Colbert, architect, city planner for Lake Charles. Mr. Colbert also instituted the program for modern schools in New Orleans. Gentlemen, what are the most frustrating problems in city planning today?
John, in order to answer that, I'd say it would be twofold. One is, of course, having to take the patient as we find him. New Orleans was considerably old before we thought about city planning of any kind. And two, the ever-increasing number of vehicles on our city streets and the growing rate of population. Or in short, trying to put too many people on less and less space.
Well, it seems to me that a problem even more basic is the educational problem of awakening a consciousness on the part of people, not only for the desirability, but the absolute need for planning as a matter of spiritual, physical, and economic survival. I think it's only since World War II that the American public has begun to even sense the dimensions of the planning problem which face it, and even now, with that just beginning of a consciousness, I think it is still a very confined to a very narrow point of view. For instance, we, for the most part, is confined to that of the physical planning, and yet we know that that isn't the whole story at all.
John, I'd like to break in here a minute, if I may. I so much agree with you. You've talked about the physical, and Louis has, because he's in day-to-day contact with the immediate physical needs of the city. But I don't think we can overemphasize this problem of dealing with the spirit of the city, with dealing with what the character of the city might be rather than what it is. Cities that have taken advantage of it are not many in this country, probably 5. I can think of Boston coming down the eastern seaboard, New Orleans, San Antonio, San Francisco.
We have possibly more cities that are individual than possibly any other state I know of.
Absolutely, and the thing that's brought this about to a very large degree is this thing of water. I mean, we're a whole economy based on water. In Lake Charles, for instance, in developing a civic center there, we were going to have a great water jet coming out of the lake. And this represented the whole petrochemical industry in the area. And yet it was to be tailored to the scale of people, not the scale of automobiles, Louis, but to the scale of people. And water was to mean something, and it was to be a personality. This city was to be different from all the other cities. We don't want it to look like Bangor, Maine, nor Tacoma, Washington, and certainly not like Miami. We want it to look like Lake Charles, just as you want New Orleans to look like New Orleans, and yet you clutter your riverfront. Why don't we see the river, Louis?
Gentlemen, let me interrupt for just a moment. What is the architect's concern with city planning today?
Well, if I may break into that, I think the architect is beginning to realize that he must radically change his whole method of practice, and I think this change will come about within the next 15 to 20 years. The architectural profession as we know it will disappear. The architect is going to have to forget, or at least place less emphasis on the individual work. However great and beautiful this work may be, it cannot arrest the ugliness with which we have surrounded ourselves. And I hate to say it, but I think it's true that our generation has perpetrated more ugliness than any that has preceded us in all history. So I think the architect is going to have to begin to think more about environment, about a total picture, and less about his little micro problem with which he has, up to this time, been almost completely concerned.
John, I so much agree with you. There's the futility of the individual building today. I think all of us in the architectural schools and the practice of architecture feel this. We're building in a morass of confusion. Building groups are essential. The larger, the better. The space between buildings is becoming more important than the buildings themselves. We're striving for unity. The tension and confusion and traumatic mess of our cities is really developing a bunch of schizophrenics. And what we have to do, it seems to me, is to, in building our cities, to think a little beyond ourselves. Not just what we want, but what our children will want, what our children will need. The great need in city planning and architecture.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. This, as you see, is a controversial subject, and we are not all in agreement upon it. And we are making progress. In this respect, I would like to point out that other cities have the same problem, but maybe different answers, and I would like to call upon a colleague of mine, Dean Pietro Beluschi of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who will give his views on this subject and the education that are necessary to...
I don't know how satisfactory it will be to give the answer to your question from a 2,000-mile distance. I found out that architects are always surprised when find that people in general do not know what architecture is all about. And yet, architecture is there, they live in it, they raise their children, the environment, they do act in ways whereby architecture is the background of their life. And still they don't know, and architects are somewhat to blame for this. I believe that for too long a time, particularly in the last century, architects were considered, or at least they considered themselves, as somewhat decorators. The artists that will put the beauty on like a cosmetic, so to speak. So that all the things that were happening to the city, the great problems of circulation, of technical advances, of things that were bringing, in a sense, confusion to the environment of man, were somewhat swept under the carpet, you might say, by the architects. And only recently, I would say in the last 20 years, when we have become, architects in general, become very much conscious of the problem of environment, as you said a few minutes before. And now, let's look at what is happening and what is the future so far as architecture and the environment of our society is. It has been pointed out that if we grow at the rate that we've been growing in the last, since the beginning of the century, we will have something like perhaps 50 or 60 million people more in a 20 or 30 year period. It also happened that while 2/3 of the people were living in the country at the beginning of the century, now only 1/3 living in the country, and 2/3 of this enormous number of people, which will soon reach 200 million, are living in the city. So they're really busting in the seams. The automobile had brought a new dimension. People want to go out in the country. They love the country because naturally man loves nature and the trees and the birds and all the things that make life pleasant. But the moment man went out in the country, he began destroying the very things for which it was moving. Gas stations, rural slums first, and then real slums, hot dog stands, and linear development along the highways. Now all that at least have come home to roost, and we are worrying about how to solve the problem. I was trying to look for some photograph of our models of developments of taking place in Boston, but it was too short a time. I couldn't produce it in time, but any photograph almost will do to show the extent of the problem. Here, for instance, is the main building of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, designed somewhat at the beginning of the century, the second decade of the century, and reflecting the mood of architecture of the period, which is really a direct influence by the fair in Chicago in 1893. So That was a very fine, pompous, and elaborate building, certainly not functional in the sense that we understand it today, but very dignified. But what has happened to the around it? Look at the slums. Both the slums where people must live or conduct their lives, most of their lives, is really a visual nightmare. All this will have to be given order. I didn't say we can't control it, and it'll be a long process, but we are on the way of achieving something by approaching it along the line that you have given to us in the beginning of this program. So, our own students, the people that come to study with us, they do not learn things that had been done before, but they learn to relate things and to think through, to learn of cause and effect, and be, above all, educated people in the broadest possible sense, because only then they will understand the social forces, the economic forces, which really produce architecture in this much vaster meaning of the term. So architecture is not the exterior, the design, the columns, is that, yes, but is much more, is the environment of man.
Thank you, Dean Beluski. Unlike the other arts, architecture rose from a primary requirement for shelter. Architecture is in a constant flux, an ever-changing medium of expression, incapable of being static, and architecture faithfully expresses its time. Now, science and invention may occupy men's minds, but science and invention produce the two things necessary for successful art: wealth and leisure. And so we answer our three questions. What is architecture? It's a solution to human environment, the art of building for beauty and utility, the creation of a structure that will be an experience to those who see it, work in it, live in it. What can it be? It can be successful community planning that will benefit many people for many years. And what will it be? It will be research and experimentation with the end in mind to provide new and scientific replacements for outmoded systems. It is in the hands of the architect to change the face of his city and of his world. Now this is the builder. He will put away his blocks, his cards, his sandcastles, and one day he will build a monument to man's creative mind. Tulane University says goodbye now with a quotation from John Ruskin. Architecture is an art for all men to learn, because all are concerned with it.
Tulane Close-Up has been presented as a public service by WDSU-TV and produced in cooperation with Tulane University.